Good evening, or perhaps good morning, wherever you are in the world. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, get comfortable, and let the outside world slowly fade away. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? Is it late into the quiet hours of the night, or are you just beginning your day somewhere across the globe? Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Tonight, we journey back in time to a world long before central heating, electric light, or modern comforts, to a time when winter was not just a season, but a true test of survival. Imagine the year is somewhere in the 1800s. The wind howls through endless forests, snow falls silently across vast, untouched land, and in the distance, a small wooden cabin glows faintly against the darkness. Inside, a family gathers close to the fire. Every crackle of burning wood, every flicker of flame, a quiet reassurance against the cold that waits just beyond their walls. This is a story of endurance, of resilience, and of the quiet strength it took to survive one of the harshest winters imaginable. So dim the lights, relax your mind, and let yourself drift gently into the past as we begin our journey into the long, cold winter of the 1800s. In the early autumn of 1803, when the amber light of the sun lingered an hour longer in the western sky, the people of the small frontier settlement near the great river spoke in hushed tones of the coming cold. Even before the first frost, there was an ineffable shift in the air, a brittle edge that teased with promise and threat alike. Farmers rising with dawn noticed that the dew upon the fields refused to evaporate. It lay like beaded silver upon the tall grasses and clover. Children running barefoot from the warmth of their beds would pause, puzzled, as their feet stung at the touch of the grass, thick with the night's chill. The elders, faces weathered by decades beneath sun and storm, stood at their doorways and watched the dark line of the forest to the north, sensing a season's change not merely in temperature, but in spirit. In those first days, the cold was a messenger, pale and tentative, whispering that life was about to transform. Inside every cabin and farmhouse, activity quickened. The hearth, that ancient heart of home, became a place of both warmth and thought. Men and boys took axes and saws to the surrounding woodlands, choosing dry oak, ash, and hickory for firewood. They worked from sunrise until the wind began to bite, stacking logs in neat, quivering towers beside barns and sheds. Women, their skirts tucked up to avoid snagging, sorted through baskets of herbs and roots, storing yarrow, sage, mint, and other dried plants that would lend scent and strength to winter stews. The children gathered fallen branches and kindling, learning early the chant of survival: stack high, keep dry, leave nothing to chance. As the sun sank each evening, fathers returned with cheeks flushed by exertion and eyes bright with the day's accomplishment. They brought with them not only wood, but the promise of warmth for weeks ahead. Nights when the wind would howl like a lonely wolf and the ice would claim every pool and creek. Mothers took these logs and placed them by the hearthstones, counting each piece like a blessing, knowing that warmth in winter was the difference between life and sorrow.
While the air still permitted bare hands and damp soil, fields were worked with urgency. Men and women wielded sickles and scythes in rhythmic sweeps, cutting the last of the grain before frost could steal the sweetness from the stalks. Bundles of wheat and rye were tied and trundled to the barn, where mice already nibbled at their fringes, eager for the coming months of abundance. Squash, potatoes, carrots, and turnips, heavy with the earth's stored sunlight, were pulled from the ground in thick gloved hands and carried with care. The harvest was never merely agricultural labor, it was a final dance with warmth and life before the world turned white. Songs echoed across fields as wagons heaved with produce, and laughter, sometimes anxious, sometimes jubilant, rose with the dust. Children ran between rows, their laughter a counterpoint to the swish of scythes, filling the farmyard later with stories of secret apple trees and imagined treasures hidden beneath leaves. The harvest was both feast and farewell, a moment when every bright scarlet apple and golden ear of corn tasted like victory against the coming winter. As days grew alarmingly shorter and nights lengthened like stretched shadows, the rhythm of life changed irrevocably. Before the first snowflake fell, people noted how dusk arrived in the mid-afternoon, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the sky too soon. The sun, once a bold sovereign arching across a clear blue dome, now barely climbed above the horizon's dusty rim. Farmers would often stop their work before supper, not out of choice, but because the cold gray light made tasks increasingly difficult, and the wind carried a sting that crept beneath clothing and bone alike. By late afternoon, families gathered in the warmth of the hearth. Fathers carved wood or repaired harnesses, mothers mended clothes and braided rugs. Older siblings told stories to the younger ones, their voices rising and falling with the flicker of firelight. These long hours before nightfall were fertile ground for memory and myth. Tales of winter sprites, of fur-clad travelers lost in snow, of distant lands where summers never faded. Every story, while enchanting, carried a kernel of caution. Respect the cold. Prepare your heart and hearth for the trials ahead. The first real snow came not with fanfare, but quietly while the settlement slept. At dawn, a silent white stillness lay upon the world, the roofs, the fields, the gnarled arms of old oaks now glistening with frost-kissed wonder. A hush, sacred and complete, greeted the waking. Children pressed faces to frost-etched windows, breath fogging the glass as they marveled at the pristine blanket that obscured familiar paths and fences. For adults, the first snow was a threshold, a beginning that promised both hardship and beauty. On that morning, workers paused and surveyed the world anew. Footprints left the day before had vanished, replaced by a flawless white tapestry that invited exploration, yet warned of hidden cold beneath. There was laughter at first, children flinging soft snowballs and fashioning snowmen with coal eyes, but beneath even this joy lay the sober realization that winter was no longer imminent, it was here. With the snow came the necessity of proper clothing. Most families could not afford the fine furs worn by wealthy trappers or traders. Instead, they relied upon wool and layered linen, patched again and again until it carried the history of seasons past. Women knitted long stockings and thick mittens by lamplight, the rhythmic click of needles as constant as the beating of a heart. Men wrapped themselves in heavy woolen coats, sometimes made from blankets, and pulled felted hats over ears already pink with the bite of frost. Indigenous neighbors, whose knowledge of the land ran deep, were often generous with guidance: how to felt wool more densely, where to find cattail fur for additional warmth, how to trim cloaks to reduce wind passage. Traders brought scraps of sealskin or deerskin, treasure traded in times of need for a handful of flour or salt. In these exchanges lay a shared understanding. Winter was a teacher of humility, and survival often required cooperation across cultures and boundaries. The hearth was a crucible of survival. Every morning before dawn, before the sky blushed with dawn's first promise, the fire was rekindled from embers banked deep under cold ash. Wood was fed slowly, piece by piece, so the heat could become a steady companion rather than a blazing, wasteful flame. It was said that a well-tended fire was like a patient friend. It would give warmth without complaint, as long as one respected its nature. Inside the cabin, bodies gathered close to the hearth, and voices fell into lower tones, as though the fire had its own solemn voice that demanded quiet understanding. Stews simmered in iron pots, turnip, barley, sometimes pork, filling the air with a scent that was at once comforting and stirring. Coffee boiled with patience as families suppered on thick slices of bread and whatever vegetables remained crisp in the root cellar. The crackle of flame and the hiss of steam became the music of winter evenings, a rhythm that steadied the heart against the temerity of cold winds beyond the cabin walls. As the white world deepened, every family turned their thoughts to what lay under the earth's skin, the root cellar, a humble cave-like space dug into a hillside or beneath the barn, was the silent vault of survival. Buried within were crates of potatoes with russet skins thick from the field, parsnips that tasted of sweetness beneath frost's hard touch, beets that would sustain soups for weeks yet to come. Apples, some tart, some sweet, were wrapped in straw so they might not bruise, and stored in layers like jewels glowing in the dim subterranean half-light. Mothers opened jars of pickled cabbage and cucumbers sealed in gleaming glass. They cracked the lids with knowing fingers and inhaled a sharp, tangy scent that carried memories of summer sunshine. Big crocks of sauerkraut lined the packed earth shelves, their sour perfume infusing the damp, cool air. Barrels of salted pork, fat slick beneath coarse burlap, waited to be boiled and cut into rich chunks for stew. These provisions, hidden in earth's embrace, were not just food, they were reassurance, a promise that even when the world was white and still, life could continue in warmth and flavor. Outside the cabins, animal companions felt winter's quest for survival in every bone. Workhorses, loyal and patient, had been brushed and blanketed in layers of thick woolen cloth. Men trudged alongside them each morning, breath billowing in puffs of white, guiding hooves through banks of snow to unfrozen water troughs. Horses stood with hobbled patience, their flanks misting in cold air, trusting that humans, their lifelong partners, prepared feed and shelter well before the next gale struck. Dogs, those vigilant guardians and beloved companions, padded about in wide, confident steps. Many wore simple leather collars or braided straw wraps around their paws to reduce frostbite, though the chill still gnawed at delicate pads. Wolves and coyotes, distant relatives, skulked at the edges of settlements, drawn by scent and hunger. On bitter nights, dogs huddled close to the hearth or beside sleeping children, breathing warmth into the shared blankets. In every meadow and yard, the rhythm of snores and the twitch of dreams testified to an animal wisdom as ancient as the cold itself.
In towns and villages, where wooden houses and modest shops clustered near dusty main streets, the first snow changed the rhythm of commerce and life. Blacksmiths paused at noon to wipe a sheen of sweat from brows and survey windows half frosted with intricate, fern-like patterns. Bakers rose while stars still glittered in the cold sky to stoke ovens beyond their roaring midday fire, rising loaves of brown bread that would be sold warm, a fleeting but treasured luxury. Children made their way to a one-room schoolhouse, their breath steaming in soft clouds, eyes wide with reminders that winter was no longer a rumor, but a season reigning over them. Shopkeepers draped heavy blankets over store windows at night, slowing heat loss and protecting fragile goods, buttons, thread, flour sacks, and yards of cloth for mending. Horses' hooves clattered on snow-packed boards of the street, and the ring of harness bells was as much a part of winter's score as the gusts threading through narrow lanes. At taverns, travelers warmed frozen fingers around mugs of hot cider or diluted spirits, telling tales of frozen creeks and lost gloves, of roads so soft with snowpack that wheels seemed swallowed by the white path. In the Great Plains, where grass once waved like liquid gold, winter snow fell in shimmering drifts that could swallow wagons whole. Travelers and homesteaders learned early to read the language of the prairie wind, to know where snow would deepen like a sea and where drifts would lie shallow like ripples frozen in place. A family crossing these open lands with a loaded wagon moved slowly at first, then with a gritty resolve that came from necessity. When the snow fell fast enough to blur the horizon, they wore scarves over faces, goggles made from greased cloth, and pinned every edge of garment so wind could not find a way beneath. The horse team strained, bells on their collars chimed a forlorn, hopeful tune against the whisper of falling flakes as the driver cracked his whip, not in anger, but in ritual, to tell the animals they were seen, they were needed, and together they would press forward. Children in the wagon, cheeks colored like ripe berries, peered up at the sky, finding wonder in every flake's descent, each one a crystalline miracle despite the cold that bit beneath their layered coats. Nights on the prairie were like nothing else, deep, breathtaking silence, punctuated only by the low moan of wind and the rhythmic crunch of tired hooves. Rivers, once lilting and bright with summer reflections, became slow mirrors of ice and cold. First, a fragile skin of clear ice stretched across shallow bends. Then, with patient insistence, the ice thickened, cutting off the lazy flow and turning the river into a living road. Ice fishermen walked across it with care, augers in hand, cutting neat circles into the opaque surface to drop lines of baited hooks for trout and pike. They sat with stupor and patience in the bitter air, breath hissing in rhythmic puffs, trading tales of early winters that raged like beasts and mild ones that teased like coy lovers. Young boys, bundled so thoroughly that only eyes and nose peeked from quilts of wool, slid across the thick ice on simple skates honed from repurposed metal. Laughter soared like warm smoke, bright against the white dais of river ice. Mothers watched from the shore, hands wrapped tightly around steaming mugs, marveling at how children transformed cold into play. But beneath the joy was always respect. Thin ice was danger, a sudden crack, a shattering note that could end laughter with panic. Survival in winter, even in sport, was always wreathed in caution. Winter did not arrive silently. It had its own voice. The hiss of wind against eaves, the groan of old trees bending beneath heavy frost, and the sudden startling crack of a branch giving way under ice all became part of the daily soundscape. At dusk, when lamps were lit and families drew close to supper, the wind sometimes sounded like a procession of ghosts, a hollow moan that bent the heart toward reverie. Children, tucked beneath quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, listened for familiar creaks and rattles and learned to distinguish the howl that meant approaching snow from the whisper that meant passing chills. Every sound in winter was a lesson. Drums of frost on roofs told of deeper cold to come. The crunch of fresh snow beneath booted feet gave rhythm to morning chores. At night, some whispered that the wolves called to each other across great distances, their howls echoing against hills like ancient longing. Others said it was merely wind teasing imagination. Yet each household knew the music of winter was both wonder and warning, an unbroken score that carried them through long nights. As snow deepened on the land, roads became both treacherous and lonely. Wagon ruts filled with ice and slush slowed travel to a crawl. Frontier families, who once relied on carts for hauling goods, now layered burlap and straw beneath wheels to reduce freezing. Bridges over small creeks were slippery and often hidden beneath snowdrifts, demanding careful observation and patience. Travelers learned to read the landscape, a dark line of bare trees, a subtle change in snow texture to anticipate where paths led or ended. Coaches in towns moved cautiously, horses' hooves ringing against icy cobblestones. Passengers wrapped themselves in thick cloaks, blankets draped across knees, cheeks pink from cold that penetrated even layers of wool. Inns along the road offered warmth, fire, and bread, often bustling with merchants, trappers, and travelers sharing news of road closures, deep drifts, or sudden storms. Winter travel was slow, deliberate, and fraught with uncertainty, teaching all who journeyed that preparation was as vital as courage. With the bitter cold came the specter of sickness. Coughs echoed through cabins, influenza spread quietly along trade routes, and frostbite claimed the fingers and toes of the unprepared. Families relied heavily on home remedies, decoctions of willow bark for fever, honey mixed with herbs to soothe sore throats, poultices of cabbage leaves and clay for inflamed limbs. Indigenous communities shared vital knowledge, teaching settlers to brew teas from pine needles, juniper berries, or inner bark to strengthen lungs and stave off infection. Nutrition was equally crucial. Winter diets, while monotonous, aimed to provide caloric warmth. Stews thickened with potatoes, beans, and salted meats offered not only energy, but comfort. The elderly, sickly, or very young were tucked near the hearth, wrapped in quilts layered over blankets, their heads cushioned to prevent loss of heat. Community support became an informal health system. Neighbors delivered extra food, blankets, or firewood to those too frail to gather supplies themselves. Despite harsh conditions, winter was also a time of social cohesion. In villages, quilting bees and barn raisings moved indoors or around sheltered hearths. These gatherings served practical purposes: patching clothing, reinforcing buildings, stitching quilts to cover cold floors, but also nourished the spirit. Stories were shared, tales of ancestors who had survived worse winters, legends of spirits who protected crops, and fables of clever hunters and fur trappers. Music occasionally punctuated the work, fiddles, flutes, or simple clapping keeping rhythm, lifting hearts against the monotony of white landscapes. In some indigenous communities, winter ceremonies celebrated the endurance of life. Smoke from fires carried prayers and gratitude into the crisp air. Feasts were modest yet symbolic, acknowledging animals, the sun's return, and the survival of the community. Even in harshest regions, warmth was cultivated not only in the body but in the heart, a collective defense against isolation and despair. Night brought the family together around the crackling hearth, a ritual essential to psychological survival. Adults recounted stories that blended memory, caution, and wonder. Children listened wide-eyed as tales of trapped travelers, clever foxes, and legendary storms unfolded. These narratives carried practical knowledge: how to navigate snow, how to find water beneath frozen lakes, how to avoid frostbite. Yet they also offered escape, a brief sojourn from the stark white world pressing against cabin walls. The fire's flickering light played across faces, casting shadows that grew long with the evening. Cats purred and dozed nearby, dogs curled at the edge of warmth. Meals were modest but rich with the smell of simmering vegetables, herbs, and cured meat. In those moments, life felt safe, rhythmic, and contained, a fragile equilibrium maintained against the relentless pressure of winter's cold. For many, winter was more than survival. It was spiritual instruction. Cold was seen as a test of fortitude and resourcefulness, an elemental force demanding respect. Diaries and letters from the era reveal reflections on patience, humility, and gratitude. Some villagers lit candles on windowsills, not only for illumination, but to signal hope, ward off misfortune, and honor lost kin. Indigenous teachings spoke of the snow as a cleanser, a renewal for the earth and mind, urging people to travel mindfully, harvest sustainably, and treat neighbors with kindness. In quieter moments, families gazed through frost-edged windows at the endless white horizon, contemplating the resilience required for human life. These reflections were often silent, personal yet collective, an unspoken pact among generations to endure, preserve, and emerge on the other side of winter with both body and spirit intact. In the spring of 1816, people across the northern hemisphere lived as though some unseen decree had forever banished the sun. Farmers in New England watched buds freeze on the vine. Soldiers on furlough felt frost against their ankles in June. And European villagers lit lamps at midday to chase away a gloom that seemed unbroken by daylight. This year would come to be whispered among elders as 1800 and froze to death, for the summer never truly arrived. Only generations later would scientists piece together that an immense volcanic eruption on a distant Indonesian island had spewed ash high above the world, cloaking sunlight and chilling the Earth's surface in a grand volcanic winter unprecedented in modern memory. In April 1815, Mount Tambora erupted with violence that tore the mountain open and hurled ash into the stratosphere. That distant blast, so powerful it was heard hundreds of miles away, sent particles circling the globe, creating a veil that dimmed the sun for months. The following year, crops in England wilted under chill rains, frost kissed the blossoms of French orchards, and in the young United States, frost returned in June, blighting corn and beans that families hoped would feed them through winter. Even hardy pastoral lands that once laughed with life under summer skies seemed murky and pale, as though nature itself had forgotten warmth. Farm journals from the era, scratched in ink, smudged by cold hands, tell of June mornings when fields were white with snow and rivers donned thin coats of ice far earlier than seasons should allow. One June day in Albany, New York, snow fell steadily from dawn until midday, burying young grain under a cold lace of flakes that would never melt. Farmers crossing their fields in disbelief wrote of frost every month of the year, of crops that seemed to neither thrive nor live, and of children who wondered why summer had become a stranger. As crops failed, the specter of hunger crept through towns and villages. Grain, once abundant, climbed in price so rapidly that even those who had saved could feel their stores shrink in value. In some farmsteads, families resorted to eating pigeons, raccoons, and whatever wild roots they could boil into a semblance of nourishment. Tales spread of people queuing at market stalls, desperate for oats to feed their horses or a few ears of corn to keep livestock alive. Some looked to the heavens, convinced this strange chill was divine admonition. Others blamed shifting wind spirits or the wrath of gods unseen. What they could not know then was that nature itself was reshaping life across continents. Even firewood became a commodity not easily taken for granted. While most families had prepared stacks of seasoned hardwood the autumn before, high, orderly, and promising warmth, the unexpected chill strained those piles at a rate few anticipated. Winter's reach seemed to encroach earlier and grasp longer. Wood was burned not only for the hearth at night, but sometimes to maintain a tender warmth during unusually cold spring mornings. Bishops and ministers exhorted their flocks to conserve, and neighbors began informal exchange systems, a bundle of kindling for a jar of salted pork, a night's fire embers for a day's supply of root vegetables. Every ember held the fragile line between warmth and peril. Travel, already difficult in deep winters, became nearly impossible when snowstorms continued well beyond traditional cold months. Men hitching horses to wagons found wheels bogged deep in white drifts, and the familiar clatter of coach travel fell silent as inn fires grew bright with use and empty of guests. Reuters-like letters carried between settlements described roads impassable as rivers frozen in midwinter, heralding both remoteness and isolation. Families heard of friends farther afield only through these fragile, frost-nipped postcards, their ink smudged where moisture and cold had met. Market towns languished under winter's unyielding grip. Bread, a daily staple, became lean where flour was priced by weight and golden tokens of currency. Bakers measured dough as if each loaf was a prayer, rationing warmth beneath heavy blankets to coax life into yeast that, under normal summers, would have danced easily. Livestock markets saw skeletal cattle massed in pens, their ribs etched against winter's outline, and traders whispered of creatures worth far less than meat, for the cost of feeding them through endless cold exceeded their value. Every aspect of agrarian life bent towards survival, and every soul felt the strain. Even as desperation grew, people clung to stories that warmed the heart. Around hearths, wood smoke curled like prayer flags towards ceilings darkened by soot and season. Elders told of winters past, softer, quieter, and children listened wide-eyed as parents spoke of mythical frost sprites and wind giants hammering ice into riverbeds. Fiddlers in village halls played lamenting tunes, waltzing shadows beneath torchlight, reflecting both sorrow and resilience. In those gatherings, each note was a testament that even against relentless cold, human warmth, in music, in laughter, and shared bread, continued to flourish. For some, the hardship sparked thoughts of distant lands and warmer fields. Tales of fertile valleys west of the Appalachians spread like wildfire in cold hearth tales, whispering promises of soil unclaimed and seasons more forgiving. Families weighing their few belongings debated hearth loyalty versus the chance of greener climes. Agricultural songs of westward migration took shape in towns, carried by folk carrying hearts palpably full of both fear and hope. In those fraught years following 1816, movement ignited, a turning point that would help reshape the map of settlements beyond the icy grasp of the East. As autumn finally came on weaker wings than any in memory, people paused to reflect on a year that twisted all seasons. Many did not speak of it with bitterness, but with an odd reverence for survival, for the ways in which shared hardship forged new community bonds and rekindled ancient wisdom about preparation, resilience, and respect for nature's unpredictable scale. In Europe, famine and unrest soon gave way to renewed determination. In North America, families pooled resources and lent strength to those waning under winter's cruel reach. They could not know then how deeply that strange year would echo through history, in art inspired by moody skies, in migrations that shifted populations, and in a collective memory bound tightly to cold and survival. Blizzards came suddenly, often without warning, their icy fingers sweeping across the plains or down valley towns. Travelers on open roads would be caught unawares, snow thick enough to obscure fences, homes, and even the dim glow of distant lamps. Frontier families, aware of the signals, a sudden drop in temperature, strange stillness among animals, a sharp wind from the north, would shutter windows, double the fire in the hearth, and gather children close, their small faces pressed against wool blankets. The sound of a blizzard was unlike any other, a deep, unrelenting howl that bent trees, rattled rooftops, and stirred the dust of lifelong past into every corner of a cabin. In the heart of a storm, the hearth became not just a source of warmth, but a beacon of hope. Families maintained fires through long, bitter nights, feeding them with every dry log available, coaxing sparks into lasting flame. Smoke spiraled through chimneys, marking the human presence in an otherwise frozen landscape. The simplest of tasks, boiling water, cooking turnips, rendering fat, became sacred rituals, each act infused with careful attention and reverence for survival. Fires also served practical purposes. Heat prevented pipes from freezing, thawed water kept the family hydrated, and the steady glow offered psychological comfort against the oppressive darkness of endless snow. By midwinter, stores began to dwindle, forcing ingenuity. Cabbages, turnips, and root vegetables were boiled slowly in iron pots, thickened with breadcrumbs, barley, or dried beans. Salted meats, pork, beef, occasionally venison, were rationed in small, measured portions to extend their use. In towns, bakers offered bread in limited quantities. In frontier homesteads, families baked only what was immediately necessary to conserve firewood and flour. Water, often drawn from near-frozen wells, was heated sparingly, each cup a careful measure of life. Survival became an intricate choreography. Heat, nourishment, and energy were balanced against the unforgiving demands of winter. Many frontier families innovated to retain heat. Thick blankets of straw were layered beneath floors. Doors were sealed with cloth or mud to prevent drafts. Even windows were coated with thin layers of animal fat to reduce heat loss. Indigenous techniques, shared through trade or observation, were adopted. Smoke from fires was directed to heated stone walls. Tightly woven mats insulated sleeping areas, and small alcoves were carved in cabins to trap warmth near beds. In towns, shutters were closed against wind, attics were cleared to reduce cold circulation, and neighbors sometimes gathered to reinforce walls in shared spaces. Every adaptation was a matter of life and death, a daily negotiation with the elements. Travel outside the immediate home became treacherous. Roads were often swallowed by drifts, some tall enough to hide fences or even wagons. Settlements became islands in white seas. Communication with distant relatives or markets slowed to weeks. Children learned early to navigate drifts in familiar paths. Men measured snow depth to determine safe routes for livestock or supply retrieval. Isolation heightened both fear and solidarity. Neighbors became crucial sources of aid, whether delivering firewood, bringing food, or sharing news of approaching storms. Frostbite was an ever-present threat. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses became numb in minutes when exposed to wind and snow. Families learned preventative techniques through experience, layering wool, rotating tasks to limit exposure, warming extremities near the hearth after short excursions, and rubbing circulation back into cold limbs. Severe cases could leave permanent damage, a reminder of winter's brutal authority. In frontier regions, those caught outdoors by mistake, hunters, messengers, or children playing too long, faced a delicate dance between panic and patience, learning that survival required both careful planning and humility before the cold. Winter survival demanded cooperation. In rural villages, neighbors shared firewood and meat. They warned each other of approaching storms and sometimes pooled resources to feed families whose stores had failed. Indigenous communities offered knowledge of edible roots, shelter building, and hunting techniques suited to extreme cold. In towns, communal granaries and markets were essential. Bakers, butchers, and farmers coordinated to stretch resources across the population. Even the smallest acts, sharing a blanket, lending a sled, tending another's fire became critical contributions to collective survival. Beyond physical endurance, mental resilience was paramount. Long nights, isolation, and the relentless cold tested patience and hope. Storytelling became a vital tool. Families recounted old legends, seasonal tales, or humorous anecdotes to preserve morale. Music, where available, lifted spirits. Simple rhythms of clapping or fiddle tunes reminded people of continuity, of human presence in the vastness of white. Writing in journals or letters offered solace, a method of organizing thoughts, fears, and gratitude. These practices were as essential as food or fire, intangible strategies for enduring the relentless winter. Years like 1816, the year without a summer, taught profound lessons. Communities that survived longest were those that planned ahead, diversified crops, conserved fuel, and cooperated across social boundaries. Folk wisdom about layering clothing, rationing food, and maintaining warmth became formalized in letters, diaries, and local teachings. People understood that survival was a combination of knowledge, skill, and instinct, and that respect for the forces of nature was not optional but essential. Winter hunting required skill, patience, and deep knowledge of the land. Forests blanketed in snow became both a hunting ground and a trap. Tracks of deer, rabbit, and fox could be read like lines in a book. Hoofprints pressed deep in soft snow, faint scratches where small animals searched for buried roots. Hunters dressed in layered wool, fur-lined boots, and cloaks to camouflage against the white expanse. Rifles and bows were carried carefully, their metal cold to the touch, requiring gloves that preserved dexterity. Hunting trips were long and deliberate. Men tracked game for hours, reading the subtle signs left behind: broken twigs, tufts of fur, and footprints winding across drifts. Success meant fresh meat for stew, pelt for clothing, and bones for tools, a complete cycle of sustenance. Failure, especially in towns far from markets, could mean rationing stretched even thinner, teaching every hunter the necessity of patience, respect for the animal, and keen observation. For smaller creatures, rabbits, squirrels, and birds, trapping provided essential supplementation. Snares were hidden in brush, baited with scraps of bread or fruit saved from the summer harvest. Birdlime and simple nets were used near frozen streams to catch waterfowl that had not migrated. These small acts of ingenuity kept kitchens simmering, particularly for families isolated by deep snow. Children often assisted, learning the craft from elders, and in doing so absorbed lessons about rhythm, patience, and the interconnectedness of life in the frozen woods. When storms raged outside, people turned inward. Knitting, weaving, and sewing became daily rituals, producing clothing, blankets, and patches for worn garments. Women spun wool into yarn, dyed with natural pigments from berries and roots, creating vibrant threads that would warm both body and spirit. Men mended tools, sharpened knives, and repaired wooden implements essential for hunting, farming, and firewood collection. Crafts were more than utility. They were meditative acts, each stitch, cut, or carve a way to pass time, maintain skill, and preserve hope during months when outdoor life was nearly impossible. Winter kitchens were places of both creativity and survival. Smoke curled from iron stoves and large kettles, soups bubbled with salted meats, root vegetables, barley, and dried herbs. Families boiled sugar and molasses into glazes to coat small pastries or preserve fruit. Pickling continued indoors, with cabbage, cucumbers, and even berries transformed into long-lasting sustenance. Root cellars remained vital, their cool darkness preserving potatoes, onions, and apples while keeping them safe from frost. Every action in the kitchen, from stirring a stew to sealing a jar, was a calculated measure to stretch limited supplies through months of isolation. Even in hardship, winter brought ritual and celebration. Christmas and New Year were modest but meaningful. Candles lit in windows, small gatherings around the hearth, and simple treats like sugar cookies or roasted chestnuts. Families sang carols, recited poems, or told stories passed down through generations. These moments broke the monotony of endless white, strengthening communal bonds and offering respite from relentless cold. In frontier areas, neighbors might gather for music and storytelling, sharing food and warmth in barns or homes too small for full households, creating traditions that blended practicality with joy. Winter was a time for reflection and ritual. Fireside prayers, blessings over meals, and silent gratitude for survival became commonplace. Indigenous communities performed ceremonies honoring animals, the sun, and spirits of the land, teaching settlers to respect cycles of nature. Many settlers integrated these ideas into daily life, seeing winter not only as a challenge, but as a spiritual teacher. Patience, humility, and gratitude were lessons writ large in snowdrifts, frost, and long, quiet nights. Children were not idle observers, they were active participants in survival. They carried water from wells, helped feed livestock, gathered kindling, and assisted in kitchen tasks. Play adapted to the cold. Sleds became vehicles for hauling firewood, snowbanks for building shelters, and indoor games for teaching patience and dexterity. These early lessons forged resilience, imparting both practical skill and psychological endurance, ensuring that the next generation would carry forward the knowledge needed to survive winters as harsh as the one recorded in the history books. Winter had its own music, a symphony of survival. Wind whistled through trees, rattling shutters and creaking beams. Snow muffled footsteps, creating a hushed, ethereal silence punctuated only by the crackle of firewood and the distant bark of dogs. Inside, the hum of spinning wheels, chopping knives, and bubbling stews provided a comforting rhythm. People attuned themselves to these sounds, recognizing signals of weather change, the presence of neighbors, and even the subtle warning signs of danger in isolation. Life in winter was as much about listening as doing, attuning senses to survive. By midwinter, families understood that survival depended on balance between work and rest, heat and cold, food and rationing, solitude and community. Each day was a carefully measured negotiation with nature. Those who thrived combined preparation with adaptability, storing provisions wisely, tending hearths vigilantly, maintaining tools and clothing, and sustaining morale through storytelling, music, and prayer. These lessons, though learned in the harshest circumstances, became part of the cultural memory, shaping the ways communities and individuals approached all future winters. As winter deepened, storms grew more violent. Snow could fall in relentless sheets for days, burying fences, barns, and roads. Wind tore across open fields, bending trees to their knees and rattling roof beams and old cabins. Families huddled indoors, layering clothing, blankets, and quilts to preserve body heat. Those caught outdoors risked disorientation in whiteout conditions, where the horizon vanished into a uniform blur of ice and sky. Livestock was secured in barns and outbuildings, often with hay packed thick around animals to shield them from frostbite. The storm was not just a force of nature, it was a test of vigilance, planning, and communal knowledge. For frontier families, isolation became absolute during the harshest months. Roads impassable by wagon or sled left homesteads cut off from towns, neighbors, and markets for weeks at a time. Children learned the rhythms of the day by the movement of sunlight through frost-edged windows. adults by the behavior of animals near the hearth or barn. News traveled slowly, carried by rare visitors or by riders who risked life and limb to deliver letters. Solitude demanded resourcefulness. Every repair, every chore, every meal required careful attention and foresight. Isolation was both dangerous and formative, teaching self-reliance and endurance in a world shaped by snow and ice. Winter also brought sickness. Influenza, pneumonia, and typhoid were common, spreading quietly through close quarters. Cold weakened immune systems, malnutrition made bodies vulnerable, and frozen wells sometimes compromised drinking water. Families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, and careful attention to warmth. In towns, rudimentary clinics and traveling doctors were scarce. Care often came from neighbors or midwives who doubled as herbalists. Illness in winter was not only physical but emotional, as fear and anxiety compounded the challenge of maintaining warmth, food, and morale. Hearths became the lifeline in winter isolation. Fires were tended constantly, fed with logs and kindling, and surrounded by careful planning to prevent accidents. People learned to stagger work and rest near the warmth, balancing fuel consumption with the need to stay comfortable. Cooking, drying clothes, melting snow for water, and boiling medicinal herbs all revolved around the fire. The hearth was the center of life, a source of nutrition, warmth, light, and psychological comfort in a world where the snow pressed endlessly against walls and windows. The psychological toll of long nights in isolation was immense. Children sometimes cried in the dark, unsure of the storm's fury. Adults wrestled with worry over dwindling supplies, sick neighbors, or livestock. Storytelling became crucial. Around the fire, families recounted legends, shared history, or invented games to keep minds active and spirits resilient. Music, prayer, and quiet reflection were methods of maintaining sanity in the monotony of endless white landscapes. These rituals created continuity and community even when neighbors were miles away. Evening routines were purposeful and protective. Families rose before sunrise to light lamps, perform chores, and maintain the fire. Meals were scheduled to conserve fuel and energy. Children were tucked early under layered blankets, their small faces warmed by shared body heat and the lingering glow of embers. Adults rotated duties, taking turns at fire maintenance, animal care, and water collection. These practices were both practical and psychological. Establishing routine offered a sense of control over an otherwise unpredictable winter world. Isolation did not entirely sever communities. Neighbors relied on signals, smoke from chimneys, footprints in snow, or simple notes left in agreed locations. In towns, inns, and trading posts, travelers relayed news about roads, markets, and weather. Letters traveled slowly, often buried under snow for days, but they connected families, reinforced social bonds, and allowed the transfer of vital information about survival strategies. The human need for connection persisted even under extreme conditions, demonstrating resilience that matched physical endurance. The long winter nights demanded adaptation. Windows were sometimes covered with oiled paper to reduce drafts, floors insulated with straw, and doors sealed with cloth. Food preservation became art. Dried meats, pickled vegetables, and root cellars kept families alive. Clothing was layered, patched, and carefully maintained. Mittens and boots were essential lifelines. Knowledge passed between generations. What to eat, how to layer, where to store water was the difference between survival and tragedy. Every action was deliberate enough to protect life against both the cold and uncertainty. As the hours of night lengthened, families often reflected on the fragility and resilience of life. The cold, the storms, the isolation, all were tests of patience and ingenuity. Journals, letters, and whispered stories documented both loss and triumph. Livestock saved, Fires kept burning, children fed, neighbors aided. Winter was harsh and unrelenting, yet it forged a rhythm of life that demanded respect, preparation, and perseverance. In enduring the long nights, people discovered not only the limits of endurance, but the depth of human adaptability and the enduring warmth of community, even when snow pressed thick against every wall. With summer long gone and the first snow settled, families turned fully to preserving what remained from harvest. Root vegetables were stored in deep cellars lined with straw to prevent freezing. Apples were kept in cool, dry corners, their skins dusted with ashes to reduce spoilage. Meat, smoked, salted, or dried, provided protein throughout the winter. In frontier areas, families sometimes buried frozen food under snow to act as natural refrigeration. Preserving food required skill, attention, and a constant check for spoilage, as any loss could mean real hunger during the months ahead. Winter reshaped the economy. With travel limited, communities relied heavily on barter. A family with extra firewood could trade bundles for flour or sugar. Hunters might exchange furs for preserved grains, and townsfolk pooled resources to ensure everyone had essentials. Markets, when reachable, were small, crowded, and vital lifelines. Prices fluctuated wildly with scarcity, and knowing what to stock or conserve became a form of survival wisdom. These winter economies reflected the adaptability of people under stress. Social bonds and shared need became the currency as much as coins. Caring for animals was critical. Horses, cows, sheep, and chickens required shelter from snow and freezing temperatures. Farmers used straw for bedding, layered hay for warmth, and fed animals rations carefully measured to last weeks. Ice on water troughs needed constant attention. Buckets were broken and thawed daily to prevent dehydration. Illness could sweep through livestock rapidly, making observation and isolation essential. Every animal saved meant a continued source of food, labor, or clothing. Every loss could tip a family into desperation. Survival strategies varied regionally. In New England, heavy snowfall led to innovations like snowshoes and sleds for transport, while mid-Atlantic settlers relied more on barns and root cellars to withstand occasional ice storms rather than continuous deep snow. In frontier regions, settlers borrowed techniques from indigenous communities: insulation from animal hides, foraging for winter berries, and strategic hunting of larger game to supplement sparse stores. In urban centers, citizens relied on bakeries, coal for heating, and communal sharing, often paying inflated prices but benefiting from denser networks of assistance. Each region molded survival strategies to its environment, demonstrating both ingenuity and adaptation. Scarcity encouraged creativity. Families stretched ingredients into multiple meals. Dried beans, grains, and a few vegetables could be turned into thick soups, stews, and porridge. Even scraps were not wasted. Bones became broth, leftover bread made into puddings, and fruit peelings boiled into preserves. Creativity was not mere preference, it was necessity. Every meal was a combination of calculation and tradition, balancing nutrition, warmth, and limited supplies. Children learned early how to make something substantial from little, a skill vital for survival and family contribution. Labor itself shifted with the season. Snow and frozen ground limited farming, so families focused on maintenance, mending tools, chopping wood, sewing, or constructing storage. Tradespeople adapted. Blacksmiths remained busy repairing wagons and horseshoes, coopers made barrels for winter storage, and tailors crafted warm clothing. Those with skills became essential in local economies, and communities recognized the value of expertise. Barter, shared labor, and mutual aid were all strategies to survive winter's harsh grip. Severe weather disrupted communication. Letters were delayed by snow-blocked roads, travelers risked frostbite to deliver news, and even telegraph lines, where present, could be damaged by ice storms. Families relied on local observation, Wind directions, snow patterns, and animal behavior indicated approaching storms. Communication became as much about survival as social connection, a means to prepare, protect, and anticipate. Winter was not only a physical trial, but a mental one. Communities used shared meals, storytelling, and occasional games to maintain morale. Music, even simple tunes on a fiddle or flute, brought warmth to cold homes. Parents taught children songs, taught practical skills, and created small celebrations around remaining food or a warm fire. Mental resilience, hope, patience, and ingenuity was as important as calories or wood, ensuring families endured both long nights and scarcity with determination and purpose. By midwinter, routines became ingrained. Mornings began with water and fire tending, followed by chores inside and outside, rotations of heating, feeding animals, and preparing meals. Afternoons often involved crafts, repairs, and planning for the next day. Evenings centered around warmth, storytelling, and reflection. These cycles became rhythm and reassurance, anchoring life in a season that might otherwise feel endless and chaotic. Winter was not static. Sudden thaws or freezing rain could quickly change the landscape. Roads that had been impassable might briefly clear, only to refreeze as dangerous ice. Streams and rivers, thawed temporarily, became treacherous for those attempting to cross. Families had to constantly monitor temperatures and sky patterns, watching for warning signs in clouds or animal behavior. Ice storms coated roofs, trees, and fences, sometimes collapsing weaker structures. Every thaw was a calculated risk. Too early, and frost might return. Too late, and isolation continued. Isolation made human contact both precious and dangerous. In towns, neighbors gathered for trade, advice, or communal work, carefully balancing proximity with the risk of spreading illness. In frontier regions, visitors were rare and often celebrated with shared meals and stories. Church gatherings, markets, and barn dances were opportunities for news, camaraderie, and support. Yet winter's harshness demanded etiquette. Help was given with care, resources shared sparingly, and alliances maintained for mutual survival. Social interaction was a lifeline as critical as fire or food. Not all crises were predictable. Blizzards could trap families, cut off water, or collapse snow-laden roofs. Livestock could die suddenly, creating both a loss of food and a need for sanitation. Illnesses could spread quickly through tight quarters. Survival depended on rapid problem solving, digging animals out of snow, reinforcing roofs, rationing food more strictly, or improvising medicine from herbs. Those who succeeded in these crises combined experience, knowledge of the land, and cooperation with others. Each winter crisis strengthened the skills and instincts necessary to endure future seasons. Despite danger, some families needed to travel. Messengers, traders, or relatives braving snowdrifts relied on snowshoes, sleds, or carefully packed horses. Routes were chosen with precision. Hills and valleys could trap travelers in whiteout conditions. Rivers could be partially frozen and unpredictable, and forests hid hazards under snow. Those who undertook journeys understood that speed, preparation, and awareness could mean life or death. Travel itself became a testament to human determination against winter's oppressive grip. By late winter, mental resilience was tested to its limit. Endless white landscapes, long nights, and repeated storms could foster despair. Families used ritual, storytelling, and work to sustain hope. Children were kept occupied with crafts or lessons. Adults rotated chores and storytelling to maintain energy and morale. Observing seasonal changes like the slight lengthening of daylight or the first signs of thawing streams offered small but critical hope. Psychological endurance, cultivated over months of hardship, was as essential as any physical preparation. Even in the heart of winter, signs of spring crept slowly into daily life. Sunlight lingered longer in the afternoon, ice began to thin along streams, and birds cautiously returned. Families prepared for the thaw, checking barns, inspecting tools, and planning early planting schedules. Community networks remained vital, sharing news of road conditions, livestock health, and seed availability. The anticipation of spring became motivation, giving energy to the final stretch of winter. The final weeks of winter were often the harshest, a period historians called the dead of winter. Families doubled down on strategies, rationing food carefully, conserving fuel, and ensuring animals survived. Work indoors, repairing tools, crafting clothing, preserving leftover food, intensified. People relied on rituals and routines to structure days, manage fatigue, and maintain morale. Every act of preparation was a rehearsal for survival, blending foresight, experience, and community cooperation. Around hearths, stories recounted past winters, the year a barn collapsed under snow, the neighbor who fell ill and was nursed back to health, the family that survived on minimal rations through a blizzard. These narratives carried both practical advice and psychological comfort. They reminded listeners that survival was possible and that human ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience could overcome even the harshest winter conditions. These stories also reinforced community identity and cultural memory, passing lessons from one generation to the next. By late winter, reflection became natural. Families considered what had been lost, what had been preserved, and the strategies that had ensured survival. Each hardship, storms, scarcity, illness, and isolation was a lesson in patience, adaptability, and cooperation. Observing subtle environmental changes, sharing knowledge, and maintaining hope prepared communities for the eventual thaw. Winter, though merciless, became a teacher of endurance, ingenuity, and the resilience of human spirit. After months of snow, ice, and biting cold, the first signs of thaw were subtle but unmistakable. Snowbanks softened at the edges, streams gurgled beneath partially frozen surfaces, and the scent of damp earth seeped into cabins and cellars. Families emerged cautiously, testing the firmness of thawing ground before stepping beyond the cleared yard. Windows were opened to release stale, heated air, and fires were reduced to embers, though the nights remained cool. Every thaw marked a slow transition, a tentative easing of winter's relentless grip. Spring was a season of repair and renewal. Roofs damaged by ice and snow were patched, fences rebuilt, and barns cleared of accumulated ice and debris. Tools dulled by winter wear were sharpened, sleds, wagons, and plows were checked and mended. Families and neighbors worked together, sharing labor and resources to prepare homesteads for planting and mobility. Even small efforts, such as repairing a door or reinforcing a chimney, had lasting impact, ensuring that the months of survival did not leave lingering vulnerabilities. Animals that had endured months of cold required careful attention. Feedings increased, pastures were examined as snow receded, and livestock were allowed to roam gradually as the ground thawed. Weak animals received extra care, warm bedding, additional rations, and gentle handling. Recovery from winter stress was gradual. Those who had survived were often healthier and more robust, a testament to careful management, foresight, and the ability to anticipate challenges before they became crises. Spring marked the earliest preparations for the growing season. Seeds stored from the previous year were sorted, soil inspected and tilled where possible, and gardens readied for planting. Root crops were sometimes replanted in sheltered areas, while hardy vegetables were sown as soon as frost risk diminished. Planting required careful observation of soil and weather, as misjudging the thaw could destroy tender seedlings. Families understood that surviving winter was only part of the cycle. Preparation for productive months ahead ensured continued sustenance and security. As roads cleared and rivers became navigable, communication and trade resumed in earnest. Neighbors visited more freely, markets reopened, and news traveled again. Families who had survived isolation shared stories, resources, and warnings. Community gatherings celebrated the end of the harshest months. Shared meals, music, and even small festivals allowed both children and adults to release the tension accumulated over winter. Social bonds, tested and strengthened, became central to rebuilding life. Surviving winter was more than enduring cold. It was a series of lessons in patience, ingenuity, and cooperation. Families reflected on which strategies had worked and which had failed, recording experiences in journals or recounting them in stories. Children learned the rhythm of seasons, the value of preparation, and the importance of community. Elders shared wisdom gained through decades of winters, ensuring that practical knowledge became embedded in the collective memory of the settlement. Spring brought not only physical relief, but psychological renewal. The longer days, warmer sun, and greening landscape lifted spirits, alleviating the mental fatigue that had accumulated through months of isolation and storms. Families celebrated small victories, surviving illness, maintaining stores, protecting livestock, and enduring the harshest nights. The human mind, like the landscape, began to recover, filled with renewed hope, energy, and anticipation for the productive months ahead. The long winter left enduring lessons. Adaptability, planning, skill, and cooperation had proven essential for survival. Families understood the necessity of diversified food stores, layered clothing, careful rationing, and reliance on community. They learned to read the weather, track the land, and respect the limits of both human endurance and nature's power. These lessons were more than practical. They shaped character, social bonds, and the rhythm of life in rural and frontier communities for generations to come. Even as the last snow melted, people remained aware that winter would return. Preparation, foresight, and vigilance were lifelong habits, and the experience of survival forged resilience, resourcefulness, and gratitude. Life moved forward, shaped by both the hardships endured and the warmth of the renewed season. In every cleared yard, repaired barn, and budding garden, the memory of the long winter persisted, a silent reminder of human determination, adaptability, and the enduring capacity to survive against the most unforgiving natural forces. As winter approached in the 1800s, families began their meticulous preparations. Cabins and houses were reinforced, roofs patched, doors sealed, and chimneys checked for proper ventilation. Firewood was stacked in dry areas near the home, often covered with tarps or straw to keep it from freezing or getting damp. Families rationed the last summer produce, moving root vegetables, dried grains, and preserved meats into the coolest, most secure parts of the house. Every detail mattered. Survival depended on foresight and diligence. And now, as our journey through the long winter of the 1800s comes to a quiet end, the storms have softened, the winds have grown still, and the world, once frozen and harsh, begins to rest in silence. The fire inside the cabin burns low, its gentle glow casting soft shadows along wooden walls. A final warmth after months of endurance, resilience, and quiet strength. You've walked through the snow-covered forests, felt the cold winds, sat beside the crackling hearth, and witnessed the strength it took to survive a winter without modern comforts. And now it's time to rest. Let your thoughts slow down, let your breathing become calm and steady, and allow the quiet sounds around you to carry you into sleep. If you're still awake, I'd love to know where you listened from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Your messages are always a comfort to read, a reminder that even across distance, we are all sharing this quiet moment together. Thank you for spending this time with me. Now, close your eyes, let the warmth of the fire stay with you, and drift gently into a peaceful, deep sleep. Good night, wherever you are.